Good evening to everybody and thanks for joining. Some weeks ago, they asked me here at the Recent Globe to do something about Trump and fascism. And at this moment, they had this nice pamphlet with a picture. And Trump, the real-time Trump, was in the second term of his presidency for some weeks. And I was quite intrigued to do this, also because I've written some years ago an article on after the January 6th Capitol attack, a comparison of the March on Rome and the January 6th Capitol attack. And I've written this for the Neue Zürcher Zeitung, which is a rather conservative, liberal Swiss newspaper. Probably everybody knows this here in Germany. But normally they weren't that open to such topics as fascism for quite a long time. And the end of the first presidency of Trump was such a shocking event that they decided to have this kind of article discussing fascism in a global context, discussing Mussolini together with Trump. And I thought at this moment I will jump on the opportunity because it will never come again. I really didn't think about that. We will have this new opportunity, and even with the much worse global conditions in now 2025. But then there was another reason why I was intrigued to speak about this, and this article got quite a harsh reaction from Swiss right-wing people, and responsible for this was especially this guy here, Roger Köppel, who probably some of you know. He was a chief editor of Die Welt in Germany, but he turned this Swiss weekly newspaper, Die Weltwoche, into some kind of right-wing propaganda tool. He's reading the news every morning and has some kind of YouTube show connected to this, even sending to Germany, I think. And he was really not pleased about the fact that I compared Trump to Mussolini. And he is a historian too. He was basically saying that's the end of historiography if people are doing so bad work and so on. But by now, he's really turned. You see him here sitting next to Gerhard Schröder and Viktor Orban in a discussion round on the topic Ukraine has lost the war, organized by the Weltwoche, which I think is quite often now discussed in this also rather conservative but more liberal newspaper like the Frankfurter Allgemeine. So the Frankfurter Allgemeine labeled this the Schweizer Moscow connection, the Swiss Moscow connection. And I took this as a motivation in the sense because what you see here is that fascism has matured quite a lot in the last years, I would say, because very traditional left-right wing political settings, which have worked quite well in single nation states, are completely in chaos and broken up. You have here a Swiss politician who is member of the parliament and who is openly siding with Moscow. This is quite strange, for example, in the Swiss context, and you would find this basically now everywhere. And I think it's a sign, we have seen this in the interwar years too, if fascism is really becoming a third option, then it's breaking up this left-right national setting and creating chaos by trying to bring in ultra-nationalist revolution. And some label this as being something which is neither left nor right, but in between. I would say it's much more on the right side, obviously, but it's not fitting in these national settings. And so I thought it would be a good moment to revisit what I have written. And I was even a little bit more surprised on the harsh reaction of Köppel, because what I wrote about, or my assessment concerning the March on Rome and the attack on the Capitol, wasn't that I really claimed that Trump was a fascist. So I wrote the situation in the US has stabilized, demonstrating the resilience of American democracy and its institutions. You should not ask historians to do this kind of job. But the next thing is important for today. But the next shockwave needs not to come from here. In fact, that is rather unlikely, as the history of fascism suggests. In the interwar period, the challenge came from powers in the second row, Germany, Italy, and Japan. But even this was enough for Köppel to react very violently on it. To give you some fact, I mean, what I'm telling you now, it's more or less common sense. There was a poll in April, and more than half of the people asked, or of the Americans asked, were saying Trump is a dangerous dictator. At this moment, this is a poll from October 24, made by ABC News. It's probably difficult to see, but 42% were saying Trump only is the fascist of the both candidates, and 6% were saying both are. So around half of the people, even before the election, labeled him as a fascist. You see that the concept is very difficult to pin down, because also 60% claimed that Harris is a fascist, and together with the 6% who were sure that both are, almost a quarter of the Americans asked this question, labeled Kamala Harris as a fascist. And this is a problem for the concept as such, that this was really used for political propaganda and so on, because obviously this was not the case. But that would be the background, so the historians are still discussing in some way if fascism is a label we should use. But for big parts of the population of the United States, at least, this has become a real thing. So especially in the context of the January 6th attack, some of the most famous historians of the United States changed their mind. And one of them was Robert Paxton. This is a New York Times article. The title reads, "Is it fascism? A leading historian changes his mind." And now the interesting thing about Paxton here is that this fascism debate amongst scholars is mainly about two questions: the accuracy of the term fascism for Trump, or what's happening in the United States, and then the question of the usefulness. Is this useful? And most of the people would side with one of the sides, say no, it's not, we shouldn't label him fascist, and it's not useful to make this comparison. And there's even now much growing, obviously, and probably the bigger part of scholars who would say it's accurate to speak of fascism, and it's useful to do this. And with this, the lessons from the interwar fascism come into play. But what Paxton is saying, and that's quite unique, he would say, yeah, he is a fascist, but it's not very useful to use this term. And he's saying, I'm not pushing the term because I don't think it does the job very well. I think there are ways of being more explicit about the specific danger Trump represents. So he would say, yes, fascist, but not very useful. So I will try to use the remaining 30 minutes to show that Paxton is right on the one hand, that probably this very direct question, if Trump is a fascist, if fascism is now rising in the United States, isn't that useful, and especially the simplistic analogies are quite useless. I will therefore also try to mostly avoid the United States and Trump for the next few minutes, also because I'm not an expert on this region of the world. I'm much more working on Germany and Japan and Italy, and I will turn to the interwar years. Therefore, the title I choose is not Trump as a fascist or something like this, but Trump and the global rise of fascism. But I think Paxton is also not right. There is a usefulness in using the term or the concept and to think as a new kind of ultranationalist revolutionary ideology, which was already there in the interwar years and which is coming up now again. to do this, why I think it's necessary, or how we can make this term fascism turn it into a useful concept, I think one important point will be to better understand where the so-called fascism debate is now, because we have a little bit the problem that Trump is really coming in a moment where fascist studies is also, or was changing very fast. And you can't see this in the broader media debate, because there normally the question what the fascist is quite simply answered. For example, here, this poll is not so clear, because the definition they gave for a fascist, asking the question if Trump or Kamala Harris is a fascist, was a political extremist who seeks to act as a dictator, disregards individual rights, and threatens or uses force against their opponents. And I mean, at least somebody who only threatens to use force, and it's not using force, I mean, by interwar standard, that wouldn't be a fascist. And many things you are describing here would be more like an authoritarian dictator. So it's not, in some ways, it's not enough to use this term. But this is how the media are dealing with this, and it's a bit complicated, because we are at a very specific point in time concerning the question what fascist studies is doing. So I will tell this tale of two consensuses is about the second part, is mainly about the state of art in fascist studies. And then the other thing is, I think there are a lot of misunderstandings what fascism in the interwar years was about. And this is connected to the state of art. But if we understand this a little bit better, then probably we would see other things and discuss all of these questions a bit differently. So this will then be more the thesis how interwar fascism should be seen. It's like a cumulative trans-imperial process of longer radicalization, I would say. So the tale of two consensuses. From an academic perspective, fascism's comeback is mainly the tale of two consensuses, one could say. The first emerged when Roger Griffin defined fascism as polygenetic ultranationalism and declared this to be a new consensus. So he used the word consensus, saying we agree all on this, and the longer definition is something like fascism is a genus of political ideologies whose mythic core in its various permutations is a polygenetic form of populist ultranationalism. The idea is that they are aiming to reproduce a mythical past and to call for a national rebirth. Obviously, we are seeing this at the moment in the United States. If they are successful, what follows is a fascist revolution that aims at a fundamental transformation of all social, culture, and political, but also geopolitical orders. And we see now attempts to do this in the United States, but I think it's still open to the discussion how far this will go. Griffin's consensus was based on a broader trend. Since the 1990s, scholars have increasingly stressed the revolutionary nature of fascist ideology. And to give you an idea how this mythic core could be labeled, or what's the thing of it, or in the core of it, the March of Rome of 1922 was seen worldwide as a quite extraordinary event, and there was a global history connected to this. And this is one double page of Taiyo, which is a Japanese magazine from January 23, showing pictures from this march on Rome. And obviously we now know by the work of historians that the March of Rome was mainly staged, that Mussolini came to power because the king let him, and so on. But this moment was very important for Italian fascism, obviously, and it was the starting point of this process of how the nation could be reborn with a new regime. And I think that's quite important now, going into the second term of Trump, how much he really used this January 6th to make clear in the beginning of the second term that he will, take vengeance on the people who were against this, who were critical about this moment. And it's some kind of mythic core, and all this movement that America has to become great again is this story of rebirth of the nation. And this has, on the longer run, going back to the interwar years, what happened in 1922 was very much obviously overshadowed by what happened in Germany in 1933, but it had an impact on many fascists all over the world, and you had like a first global fascist moment in 1922, but not many other fascist movements came to power in this moment. So this would be the one consensus, the Griffinian one, about the mythic core of fascism and the rebirth of the nation. The second is a transnational consensus, and it's a more recent one. In 2020, Angel Alcalde claimed that fascist studies had already taken a transnational turn, and that we have, and I quote him here, reached a point of no return, as scholars can no longer ignore the transnational dimension of fascist historical experience. And indeed, lately, transnational and sometimes even global perspectives on fascism's history are, in some ways, the new normal. What emerged is a mobility paradigm that builds on circulation and movement. Recent studies have thus drawn attention to phenomena such as mutual inspiration, entanglements, gravitation, hybridization, just to mention some of the concepts which are used now. This is all about fascists in movement, and the important thing is here, interwar fascism is no longer seen as a project limited to Europe, but as some kind of global phenomenon. In academia, claiming the existence of a consensus is a rather bold and somewhat contradictory move. However, without further discussing whether everybody in the field has, should, or will agree to these two consensuses, I think one thing is very clear or obvious. For over probably a decade now, they have shaped comparative fascist studies and paved the way for many new and exciting works. Furthermore, the combination of the two consensuses implies that fascism was both generic and regularly cross political borders. So you can't limit it to Italy, say it's just Italian phenomena, but you can use it to in different contexts, and it is connected to border crossing. As a result, our perspective on the ideological depth, as well as the geographical reach of the phenomenon in the interwar years, has changed fundamentally. With this consensus in mind, it's easy to see why scholars are recently much more confident in claiming that fascism was not limited exclusively to the interwar era and Europe. However, some questions remain. Some concern each consensus individually, others the problem of how the two consensuses interact with each other. First, a transnational consensus does not automatically imply a global one. Many of the insights of the mobility paradigm are coming from the history of European fascism during the interwar years. Processes of globalization of the ideology, as well as the globality of the phenomenon during those years, however, are only beginning to be understood. The extent to which fascist ideologies and movements reach beyond Europe remains subject to extensive debate. How to integrate the non-European experience with the fascism during its golden age, doing this systematically, is still quite hard to tell. I think one thing is already obvious. For a global history of fascism, it's not enough to supplement the existing narratives with non-European examples, because that's happening quite often. If you are working about Japan, people are asking you to give another perspective of how the March of Rome was received in Japan, and so you are complementing to existing stories. So I think it's not enough to supplement the existing narratives with non-European examples. Historians rather are faced with the task of crafting new narratives. Second, the idea of fascism as revolutionary ultranationalism was directly linked to historians' attention to topics such as fascist culture, imagination, spectacle, and representation. This cultural focus implied a turn away from economic and social questions that had previously dominated research agendas on fascism. In this context, the physical aspect of fascist violence has often also been rather neglected. From a global perspective, there is there is a further issue with this forced consensus. And I think that this is a quite important issue, the focus on nationalism and ultranationalism, and thus the nation and its rebirth, drew our attention away from the colonial context and imperial nexus of interwar fascism. However, fascism's genesis was from its beginning intimately interlinked with European expansion, colonial techniques of governance, racism, violence, and so on. Calls to decolonize fascist studies on every level as a research topic, as terms and approaches to decolonize them, and also the academic field as such have thus emerged recently. Third, the two consensus do not combine easily. This is due to their nature. The older one is much more theoretical, the newer is mostly a methodological question of perspective. The first longs more for definition, the second for new narratives. Combining them for a new generic definition is thus a quite challenging thing. Further, European fascisms of the interwar period were used to create generic definitions of the phenomena, especially, obviously, the Italian and the German case. And sometimes they are seen as the only authentic expression of fascism. This in turn has created an artificial division between center and periphery. But the sheer notion of center and periphery is foreign to global approaches and to global history. Because the story from the West to the rest isn't working very well, and we have shown this for very different topics, as the Enlightenment and so on. And it would be a little bit surprising if we could use this like diffusion model from Europe to the West for fascism. I think it's just not a good approach. This also implies that many of the definition idle types or step models, or there have been in older literature some checklist of what fascist is, sometimes called the fascist minimum, based on a few European regimes, are not working out very well. And Griffin already pointed to this, and I think that's also a little bit too small to read for you. So Griffin was reacting, because before Griffin was becoming one of the stars of this fascist studies thing, there was Paxton. So Griffin was very violently reacting to Paxton. And these were the good old days where the discussion on fascism, because the topic was seen as so important, were quite harsh. And so Paxton in the late 90s published article claiming there are 5 different steps of fascism. And Griffin reacted to this. And he was, I won't read the whole quote, but he was saying, Paxton's article is both ultra-traditionalist and naively descriptive, harking back to the dark ages of fascist studies. So he was basically saying, you shouldn't use a step model, and his generic definition was an attempt to overcome this. And to only give you one example why this checklist or fascist minimums aren't working well in a global, or even less well in a global context, let's speak about representation of fascist leaders. This is a topic coming up again and again, that, for example, Jan Werner Müller has claimed this in October 2024, article in The Guardian, Trump is not a fascist. But he's saying that doesn't make him any less dangerous. So he's not saying that that's a good thing, but he's claiming he's not a fascist. And he's saying fascists, on the other hand, base their legitimacy on popular acclamation. They celebrated mass rallies and created spectacles of power. Now the problem with Japan is a little bit, there are very few pictures of the emperor during the Second World War, and obviously it's not sure if he was in charge or how much he was in charge. So there was an ongoing discussion, and the killer argument normally was Japan didn't have a real leader, so it should be excluded. I was able to find, you can find some pictures, but there are very few pictures on the emperor, or when you compare this to Hitler and Mussolini. Normally in Japan, and I can only show you here one picture, and you have basically to believe me, but that would be quite typical for the Japanese case. So this guy here is Paolucci di Galboli, Italian fascist leader who was visiting Japan in March 38, and on a train travel to Osaka, he passed Mount Fuji, and he was saluting the Fuji. And so you would have picture like this, and then the Fuji would stand in Japan as a symbol of the national past and so on. Thomas and Jeff Illy have written a book about the culture of fascism, and there they claim, for example, that in the Japanese case, also the war is mostly a war without pictures. So there are very few pictures really showing mass rallies and so on. So all of this you could use and say Japan is just not fitting in. But the problem is a little bit more complex, because basically what we see at the end in Europe in the last few years of fascist radicalization in 42 to 45 is also that Hitler and Mussolini are mainly disappearing from the public. And so, for example, somebody like Goebbels would really complain about this and also tell Hitler he should be more present. Mass rallies weren't not possible anymore out of obvious reasons, but be more present in journals and so on, and he wasn't. And here you have a picture of Mussolini, probably one of the last pictures showing him, and an attempt to do propaganda. This is showing him along the Japanese ambassador and Rudolfo Graziani, war general and war criminal of the Italian army, and they are visiting the villa of Gabriele D'Annunzio in northern Italy and celebrating. D'Annunzio died 5 years earlier, so it was some kind of fascist celebration, remembering this early stage of Italian fascism. Really, at the end, this picture was taken in March 45, so some weeks before Mussolini was killed. But obviously, this was never published. So in the last years, you would almost, or the last stages of European radicalization, fascist radicalization worked very much without pictures, or not at the same level. So to claim you need this kind of spectacle all the time doesn't work out well. And that's a reason, I think, why we should be careful to take this European idea, so that you need first a leader, then a party, then a revolution. Because also for the Japanese case, for example, Japan came much more through imperialism to fascism than the other way around. Here in Germany, it was probably more the way that internal radicalization led to external imperial expansion. So all in all, one can say we are a little bit in a crisis because we have these two consensus. We don't have a new definition. It's quite clear that there is a non-European nexus to the history of fascism, but that normal checklists aren't working out very well. And that's a little bit the issue if media are using very simplistic questions, simply asking is Trump a fascist and so on. So let me come to the last bigger part on cumulative transimperial radicalization. So lately the proposal have been to see fascism much more as a process which is especially driven obviously by violence and the process of radicalization. I use this term cumulative radicalization in this context, and I'm sure many of you know the term. It's coming, or it was used as an explanation for the murder of the European Jews by Hans Mommsen. It's a structure explanation, basically, explaining why the Germans were able to kill so many Jews without having, or with producing quite a lot of chaos at the center of the National Socialist party, but also at the bureaucracy and so on. And I thought it would be quite useful to use this cumulative radicalization idea, but to look how this works out when you take different fascist regime into one analytic field. And what then it's coming up, I think, for the interwar years at last, is that the radicalization did really take place in a trans-imperial setting. So you can't really grab it if you look at the international or transnational level. And just to give you here a last impression how this looked like in Japan, this is a fascist or right-wing newspaper, even having the title Fascho. And it's an interesting moment. It's in September 1939, when the German invaded Poland, and the Italians and the Japanese didn't join into the war. And it's showing Mussolini in Libya in 1937, showing him as a kind of fascist emperor, but a benevolent imperialist, and so on. And they are even claiming, I mean, because this was one of this moment when the British tried again to appease Italy, the Italians shouldn't listen to these attempts. And that this imperial background of fascism was the reason why they were fighting. And this was really, you would see this during the 30 all the time. The process of radicalization quite often took place when imperial expansion happened. It was obvious in 31, 32 in the context of the Manchurian, or the occupation of Manchuria and the establishment of Manchukuo. It was also obvious after the Italians invaded Ethiopia, because this, for example, were the moment where, for the first time, the Japanese and the Italians, as well as the Germans and the Italians, were coming much closer to each other. So you have this process of imperial expansion, which is then leading to radicalization processes in other countries. Quite often, it's not a very direct translation process, in the sense that in German scholars were looking to Manchukuo to learn how to do settler colonialism. It was not this direct learning which was most important. It was quite often indirect process of translation. So Manchukuo basically ended the Washington system for East Asia, and this opened up geopolitical opportunities. And you can quite easily show how Mussolini, when he decided to invade Ethiopia, was pointing several times to the geopolitical opportunity given by the Manchurian invasion, and saying we have to do this the same way and expand. So it wouldn't be a very direct translation process, and in some ways a very complicated one. But overall, it's basically, I would say, a trans-imperial process of mutual radicalization. Now to come back to a short conclusion. So 2 points, and probably they are a little bit provocative ones, but you can't read it. So I have to read it again. So 2 theses. The first one would be the US is too rich. Or probably you could also say Trump is too old, or something like this. But I mean, that would be the first thesis. And the second one is we are back in 1938. So the first thesis is probably, or is connected to what Paxson also said, that we shouldn't use this term now only for the United States, and that there are some things we won't understand. And I think we have seen this during the last few weeks. What you see here on the left side, probably just to give you the idea, and it's connected to this idea that the US is too rich to turn to really to become a fascist state, that in the interwar years it was really this have-not upcoming powers who challenged the existing world order, and there was an ideological idea beyond it, so-called proletarian nations. This was introduced by Enrico Corradini in 1910, before the First World War started. It was then taken up by Mussolini. The basic idea is that class struggle should be fought out between nations and not between the capital and the proletarians. And this was why fascism is a third way, because it's not liberal, it's not really capitalistic, but it's a nation-centered ideology which would then start this class struggle or elevate it to a national level. This was the basic idea, and I mean this was very well known. Also at the end of the Second World War, this is a British propaganda card of 1944, reading something like Mussolini ha sempre ragione. This is this famous joke in Italy, so Mussolini is always right. And he's saying here, Mussolini to Hitler, we want our place in the sun and we will get it. And it's really, I mean, this was a driving force to be a have-not nation. And I think at some point Trump at the moment see the limits of this. I mean, in the United States, to only give you one example, lately when the stock markets went down, this is a problem because many people have to lose quite a lot, and they have obviously also to lose a quite important geopolitical position. So I wouldn't change that much my verdict concerning this question. I gave almost the same answer like in 2021, that probably the United States won't be the next place where it's where fascism is really rising. I have to say I'm not so sure anymore myself. I mean, the last 100 days were quite dramatic, and I don't want to play anything down, but I think on the longer run that could be a real problem. And in this point, I think if you have a very small definition of fascism and just pointing to the United States, it's not really useful. And probably also to understand what he is doing. So some people spoke of fake fascism in connection to Trump. I think he's pointing in this direction, but we have to be very careful in the next few weeks how he will act when resistance is coming up. And we probably shouldn't compare this too much to Germany, because in Germany everything went very fast. So the Ermächtigungsgesetz was there like 60 days after Hitler took power or came to power, and this means it was much faster than things even are now happening in the United States. But if you look to Italy, it's a quite different story. For Mussolini, it was very difficult after 22 to establish this new fascist regime. But then there was this famous case where Giacomo Matteotti was killed, a socialist leader, and this was in 24, and this was like a water-breaking moment, because until then, and the regime really came into crisis, because it wasn't a good thing to just kill a parliamentarian, but then they survived, and they even drove on this on the longer run. And I think we have to be very careful now to see in the United States if this how these legal issues are handled and so on. So we will see in the next few months, I suppose. But I would say I'm still quite optimistic that there will be resistance, and it will be quite difficult to break this down. But we will see. And the other, we are back in 38. That's not so a nice thing to say, probably, or it's quite problematic. But I think now, yesterday, we had this election which wasn't working out. So several politicians were speaking of Weimar. And so in Germany, it's always 1933, the reference point, and the Weimar Republic. But I mean, or the end of the Weimar Republic. But this is very much a national history. 38 is this very trans-imperial moment where wars all over the world have already started, where appeasing isn't working anymore, and where very strange alliances are coming up out of this. To just mention one, in September 38, Nero is siding with Churchill for a short moment because he's saying we have to fight fascism first and then imperialism. So it's really this moment where political alliances are shifting and where a policy of appeasement wasn't working out anymore. And also where all of this became very much globalized, because I think, and this is bringing me back to the title of this keynote. I think Trump is doing quite a lot for the global rise of fascism at very different places, and with very now with consequences we can't see at the moment, but that will be the main story, or that could be become the problem in the next few years. And therefore, I would say we shouldn't, for example, also the German medias are always comparing to 33, but we should more think about 38, because also concerning research, this 37, 38 wasn't researched that much, because the focus was very much on the Holocaust and the early 40s, the total war and the globalization of the war. And lately in Germany, quite a lot of the end on the Weimar Republic. But we have this time in between 38 where many things became possible, but they also turned very ugly. And I think in some ways we are at this moment. I think I would end it here. It's not a very positive end note, but yeah. Thank you very much for listening, and I'm hoping for a lot of questions.